Thank you. And you should have received a notice there on that. Awesome. So great. We'll jump right in here and introduce our two presenters today, Meghan Riley and Shannon Anderson, both of whom work for conservation organizations here in Wyoming. So I will let them introduce themselves. Meghan, I will pass it to you first.
Thanks, Alec. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Meghan Riley. I am the Public Lands and Wildlife Advocate for the Wyoming Outdoor Council. And I, as part of my work, cover oil and gas leasing issues on BLM lands. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Shannon.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. Shannon Anderson with Powder River Basin Resource Council. Here in my hometown of Sheridan, Wyoming. I'm our staff attorney, and I work on a lot of energy issues in the state. I wrote a rulemaking petition last fall on oil and gas bonding. So that's partly why you see the rule in front of you right now. So excited to talk to folks about it and let you know how you can get involved.
Thanks, Meghan and Shannon. Appreciate it and appreciate your time. One more housekeeping rule here. We do have a chat function here in Zoom, and we are going to ask that as Meghan and Shannon present, that any questions you might have, we are going to hold questions till the end of the presentation, where we'll have probably 15 or 20 minutes, if need be, to go over questions from attendees on the call. So without further ado, Meghan, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Alec. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully that works for everyone. All right. Thumbs up, is that? Oh, I better go in regular view. Okay, everybody see that? Okay, awesome. So as everyone knows, we're here today to talk about the oil and gas rule, which is actually called the Fluid Mineral Leases and Leasing Process Rule. That's the official title, but we'll just call it the Oil and Gas Rule for simplicity's sake. And before we get into the actual proposed draft rule, I wanted to just quickly give an overview of the rulemaking process and where we are right now. So what happens is Congress passes a law, tells an agency what it wants that agency to do. Then the agency determines if there's a need for regulations to implement that law. And if that is in fact the case, they need regulations, the agency drafts a proposed rule, they put the notice of the proposed rulemaking and publish in the Federal Register, and then we have a public comment period, which is what we're in right now. The oil and gas rule has been published in the Federal Register. It's available for all of us to peruse and comment on and through September 22nd. And after public comments close, the BLM is going to review comments and edit the proposed rule. And once they come up with a final rule, that will take several months. That will get published in the Federal Register. And then we have a final rule that takes effect. So the point is, we're at the process right now when we, as the public, have a shot to influence what the final rule looks like. And I mentioned Congress passes a law, and there's a couple laws that were passed that are playing into this rulemaking process. The Inflation Reduction Act had a lot of provisions in it that affect the oil and gas lease program for BLM, and to a lesser extent, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is also playing a little bit of a role in this rulemaking process. So now that we know what the process is like, we want to figure out, why is the BLM updating their oil and gas rule right now? So for starters, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 was passed, and it ushered in a bunch of statutory changes. And while these changes were passed into law, they aren't yet reflected in BLM's rules. So this oil and gas rule would codify those statutory changes and make sure that the agency is implementing them. Another reason the rule is getting updated is because it's quite outdated in a lot of ways. The last major revision was in 1988, which is 35 years ago now. That's a long time. And there are certain fiscal terms in the rule that are decades old. notably bonding amounts haven't been updated since the 1960s or earlier, and royalty rates haven't been touched since the 1920s. So as you can imagine, economic realities have changed a lot in the last 60 to 100 years, and it's 2023 and time to update those. And that just reflects the need for current rates and processing costs to be covered in how this oil and gas leasing program works. Another reason to update the rule is just to rebalance and improve the oil and gas leasing program. The BLM could better meet its multiple use mandate with some of the provisions in this rule, rather than prioritizing oil and gas above all else. There are a lot of other uses on the landscape, and this rule has provisions to help the agency keep a little bit more of a holistic view. And some of the provisions in the rule would also make it harder for land speculators to tie up public lands and kind of sit on a lease, not do anything with it, and keep the BLM from managing for things like conservation or recreation. The rule would also ensure a more fair return for taxpayers, and also help ensure that industry pays for cleanup costs when they do develop and drill for oil and gas on public lands. All right, so that's why the rule is getting updated, and this is going to take a little while, but I'm going to walk you through the content of the rule, and it's broken down in a few parts. We'll talk about the Inflation Reduction Act implementation, some changes to filing fees, changes to bonding, leasing process changes, and operational changes. So bear with me, there's a lot of information, but we'll get through it together. So the Inflation Reduction Act, again, these are just statutory changes that Congress passed, but they aren't yet reflected in BLM regulations. So one thing that would change is an increase in royalty rates. In the past, royalty rates, which are just like a percentage that companies pay to the government based on the production they're doing on their lease. In the past, it's been 12.5% royalty rates, and we would jump up to 16.67% royalty rates with this new rule. Similarly, there would be an increase in rental rates. Right now, companies pay $1.50 an acre for the first 5 years of their lease. With the passage of this rule, it would be $3 an acre for the first couple of years, $5 an acre after that, up to 5 years. And then beyond 5 years, right now, companies are paying $2 an acre. And in the proposed rule, it would be $15 an acre. All right, the rule would also increase minimum bonus bids. Currently, they're $2 an acre or $2 an acre or less. The rule would bump them up to $10 an acre. And there would also be the creation of an expression of interest filing fee. And just so you know what that is, the way that lands get nominated to be leased off for oil and gas is companies nominate them by putting in an expression of interest. And right now, they can do that for free, $0. But with this proposed rule, there would be an expression of interest filing fee of $5 an acre. We would also see the elimination of non-competitive leasing. That was a provision in the past where if a parcel wasn't bid on at auction, a company could scoop it up and lease it for $1.50 an acre, which is pretty cheap. And the IRA and this proposed rule would change that and eliminate that option for non-competitive leasing and leasing public lands for rock bottom prices. Finally, we would see an increase in royalty rates for Class 2 reinstatements, and that's a lot of mumbo jumbo, it sounds like, but this is just if a company's lease sort of falls out of active status and they want to get it back into active status, there's a little bit of a penalty and they have to pay higher royalty rates. In the past, for that reinstatement, they would jump up to 16.67% or more royalty rate. Now it would be at least 20%. And similarly, rental rates, they used to be $10 an acre for that reinstatement. And now with this proposed rule, it would bump up to $20 an acre. All right, so taking a step back, big picture, I mean, what is the benefit of all of these pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act getting codified in the rule? And I thought I would just pick one of these provisions and talk a little bit about the royalty rate increase and how that would benefit the public. So here in Wyoming, of course, oil and gas contributions to state and local government are huge. I mean, a lot of our public services are based on funds that come from oil and gas development in our state. And there are 7 types of taxes that oil and gas companies pay to state and local governments based on their operations. And one of those is federal royalties, which we talked about would be bumping up from about 12% to a little over 16%. And just to get an idea of what kind of numbers we're talking about, in 2020, the oil and gas industry paid state and local governments in Wyoming $1.23 billion, which part of that came from federal royalties. And the majority of that money went towards K-12 education. This is a picture of my kids' school here in DuBois, and it's a beautiful facility that was paid for a lot with oil and gas money. The oil and gas contributions also go towards the general fund and public infrastructure, and that amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars each. So the failure to raise royalty rates would just leave money on the table that Wyoming could be using for its people. So the fact that this proposed rule would bump royalty rates up stands to really benefit the people who live here and whose lands are being developed for oil and gas. And just to note for all of you, our federal royalty rates that are currently about 12% are actually a lot less than what the state of Wyoming charges oil and gas companies to drill on state or private lands in Wyoming. They already have a royalty rate of 16.67% and have for years. So this is a really common sense reform that the oil and gas rule is putting forward and stands to benefit everyone who lives here in Wyoming. All right, moving on to filing fees. We don't have to talk about all of these individually or what the amounts are changing to and from. I just wanted to note that these are some fiscal terms that are getting updated to better reflect current rates and what it costs the BLM to run the oil and gas program. And so a lot of filing fees are either getting created or increasing. So we have formal lease nomination getting created, competitive lease application going up, leasing under right-of-way going up, leases consolidation stays the same, lease reinstatement goes up, geophysical exploration goes up, final application gets created, and designation of successor operator gets created. And again, the point is just this is making sure that the oil and gas leasing program can sort of sustain itself and run efficiently, and that the BLM has the resources it needs to run the program in a way that benefits the companies and the public and makes sure that they have the resources and staff they need to do it right. And as a sort of side benefit, we talked a little bit about the fact that this rule is trying to make sure that people who are leasing these lands are actually developing oil and gas and, you know, using it for that purpose rather than just leasing lands and tying them up and not using them, because that keeps the BLM from being able to manage for other things like conservation or recreation. And so some of these fees would sort of incentivize companies to be sure that they actually want to lease there and make money, and they aren't just tying lands up to pad their portfolio. All right, so bonding reform, this one is super exciting, and it's not something that Congress passed. It's new to this rule. And as we mentioned at the top of the presentation, bonding amounts haven't been changed since the 60s, and that's a really long time. And as a refresher, all a bond is that's just money that a company puts down up front that they can have back after they've cleaned up when they're done drilling. If they've plugged their wells, they've done reclamation, gotten rid of weeds. And The issue is that bond amounts aren't sufficient to cover the cost of cleanup. So say a company puts down a $10,000 bond right now, but it would cost them $70,000 to actually clean up their site. Why would they spend $70,000 to get $10,000 back? So that's just sort of what we're talking about here. And what we would see with this new rule is individual bonds would go up from $10,000 to $150,000. We would see a raise in statewide bonds from $25,000 to $500,000. And there would actually be no more nationwide bonds or unit operator bonds. The BLM feels that they can better ensure that companies are putting up enough money to pay for cleanup through these individual and statewide bonds rather than at the national level. And in the past, companies had to put down $150,000 for their operations nationwide, and that would get nixed in this proposed rule. So again, what is the benefit to bonding reform? I think we're getting a sense of what it is, but it's basically just to incentivize companies to clean up their wells, clean up after themselves after they've finished drilling. And the issue is the vast majority of bonds today wouldn't cover the cost of cleanup for wells on BLM lands. There was a study in 2019 showing that 84% of bonds wouldn't cover the cost of cleanup in a low cost scenario. And that actually accounts for 99.5% of bonds on BLM lands. So that's a huge problem. And again, bond amounts haven't been updated since the 50s and 60s. I know the price of everything has gone up a lot in the last 60 or 70 years, including the cost to reclaim and clean up these sites. So these bond amounts really do need to be raised. And of course, the issue, if you have an abandoned well that hasn't been properly plugged and the landscape hasn't been reclaimed, you can have wells that are polluting water, air, and lands. They can leak methane gas, benzene gas, oil, brine, and there can be weeds and it's just bad scene all around. So we just are excited that this reform would fix a problem and that companies that are reaping profits rather than taxpayers be on the hook for cleaning up after themselves and doing reclamation on public lands that they've profited off of. All right, so moving on to leasing process changes. This is pretty exciting. A lot of these provisions get at the issue of lands being leased for oil and gas where there might not be much potential for oil and gas, and there might be other important resources on that land that the BLM could manage for instead, like important wildlife habitat or recreation sites, historical sites, cultural sites. So one thing that this rule would do under lease as process changes is they would use a preference criteria during the nomination process. So rather than just having companies use that informal nomination process to put forward what lands they would like to see auctioned off and have the BLM auction all of those lands off, this preference criteria system would kind of have a nationwide screen to determine what lands are appropriate to put up for auction. And some of these criteria would be proximity to existing oil and gas development. If a company nominates lands that are close to existing oil and gas development, that would bump it up in the preference criteria. If lands are nominated that have high potential for development, there's a lot of oil and gas that's known to be under the surface there, that would likewise bump it up in the preference criteria during the nomination process and make it more likely for the agency to offer it at auction. Conversely, if nominated lands have important fish and wildlife habitat, these preference criteria would deprioritize those lands for auctioning off because there might be a higher use of those lands than oil and gas. Also, presence of historic or cultural sites would similarly deprioritize lands during that nomination process and make the BLM take a step back and think whether or not that was actually a good place to be leasing for oil and gas. And finally, the presence of recreation or other important uses like grazing. The BLM would determine whether there were important other uses on that land. And if there were, that would bump those lands down in sort of the preference scale in terms of whether or not the agency wants to move forward with auctioning off those lands. So just really exciting stuff. Great for wildlife, great for people who are out on the landscape on BLM lands. There's also some changes to the nomination process. So again, that informal nomination process where companies request what lands they want to see auctioned off. In the past, companies could do that anonymously. This proposed rule would get rid of anonymous nominations. We would also see the BLM do some behind the scenes work to better ensure that we have qualified and responsible bidders and lessees, try to weed out some of the companies that are bad actors and maybe not following regulations or the process as well. And finally, we talked about this during the Inflation Reduction Act portion. There would be a filing fee to nominate lands, which again is a great way to cut back on companies nominating lands willy-nilly that don't necessarily have a lot of potential for oil and gas, and just make sure that companies are really sure that they really do think there's potential there before they tie up those lands for years. All right, and this is interesting. I wanted to flag for people that the BLM did put a request for input out in this leasing process changes section, and I'll just read it aloud to you all. The BLM requests comment on whether the preference criteria or other portions of this proposed rule should be expanded or new provisions added to discuss analysis of greenhouse gas emissions and related decision-making. So as we just went through in those preference criteria, the BLM with this proposed rule would move towards a lot more analysis of what's on the ground in determining whether a place is appropriate to offer for lease or not. But there isn't anything in the rule right now that would incorporate a consideration of the direct or indirect impacts of oil and gas drilling on greenhouse gas emissions. So if that's something that you care a lot about and you think that the BLM should be taking a more holistic approach and be considering that when they're thinking about when or where or whether to lease public lands, that's something that you can put in your public comment during this public commenting period. All right, so again, stepping back, what is the benefit to some of these regulations? And I'm going to focus on preference criteria because that's one of the provisions in this proposed rule I'm most excited about. It also gives me an excuse to put in a great picture of a pronghorn, which I'm excited to have animals in this presentation in addition to numbers. So again, these preference criteria proposed in the rule would try to help steer leasing away from important resources. And since 2012, over half of leases on public lands have been in places with little to no potential for oil and gas. And a couple of examples here in Wyoming would be this pronghorn is at Seed Skiddy National Wildlife Refuge, which itself is not open for oil and gas leasing, but there's a lot of BLM surrounding that area with really important big game habitat, sage grouse habitat that has been leased for oil and gas, where there is little to no potential for the companies to actually recover any minerals. And so, yeah, a lot of these lands with little to no potential for oil and gas overlap important habitat or cultural sites. And this limits the BLM's ability to manage for other uses. If they're trying to keep a company in compliance and managing a land for that oil and gas lease, it kind of takes away resources and hamstrings them and keeps them from being able to maybe manage as much for conservation or recreation. And so these preference criteria are great because they would be prioritizing areas near existing development with high potential for oil and gas, right? And keeping it away from these low potential lands. And that also gets a better rate of return for taxpayers and protects landscape health. So again, the preference criteria are very exciting, and I'm happy that they're part of this proposed rule. All right, finally, we'll talk a little bit about some operational changes. Lease suspensions, this is a little confusing, but sometimes a company has a lease and they tell the BLM, well, we'd like to suspend the lease and not use it for a while, but still have it in our back pocket. And these lease suspensions just kind of drag out the period over which a company can kind of have dibs on a chunk of land. And so some of these provisions in the rule would kind of tighten up the time frame on that and not let these lease suspensions drag out the length of these leases so long. So it would ensure the BLM flexibility and discretion to suspend leases for conservation purposes, but it would also put in effect shorter suspensions not to exceed 1 year. And it would have provisions to keep companies for requesting last minute suspensions at the end of their lease. And again, this is just to make sure that companies aren't hoarding land and sitting on it, that they're, getting in, getting out, and then the BLM can manage for other uses again. All right, similarly, application for permit to drill. This is something that companies need to develop on their leases. Right now, they can have one that lasts 2 years and they can have extensions on it. This proposed rule would shorten the window to a 3-year application for a permit to drill with no more extensions, which again, it's just trying to make sure that the companies are serious, they get in, get what they need, and get out so those lands can be managed for multiple uses better again. All right, then shut in and temporarily abandoned wells. I won't get into the definitions too in detail for you, but it's just wells that are non-operational, and the BLM wants to make sure that the company isn't just leaving wells that aren't operational on the landscape. So there's new requirements for operators to report idled wells. And there's also in the proposed rule, a provision to cap the length of time that a well may be idled, which again, similar to a lot of these operational changes, it's to make sure that companies are, being efficient, getting in, getting out, and not just leaving things on the landscape that aren't serving any purpose. All right, so I'm actually going to pause there and throw it over to Shannon to see if she has anything that she would like to add, because she is an expert on a lot of this and might have something to add that I did not cover.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I would just add, I think a lot of folks know that, Wyoming has its own set of rules. And one thing that you often hear is that, we're taking care of the problem. Things are good here in the state, particularly with idle and orphan wells. And that's true. Wyoming has actually done a really good job lately taking care of idle and orphan wells. But BLM's system doesn't work that way. So Wyoming's rules don't apply to federal wells. And it's really important to kind of know that distinction. So if you hear that kind of commentary out in the public, including in, wildfire comment from the state energy advisor for the governor, it's important to push back and make sure that there's an accurate understanding of that. So I would just add that, similarly, royalties and all of that are different, federal versus state. And it's just, it's kind of complicated, but they're two different frameworks. Permitting is, everybody has a state permit, but there's different rules that apply to that. So, and then the other thing I would add is just so folks know that there is an upcoming Federal Natural Resource Management Committee of the state legislature. It's October 6th in Casper. And this particular bill has been tried 2 other times and failed. And so this will be the 3rd time. Sometimes with zombie bills, you got to kill them more than once. And it's anticipation of this rule coming into effect, and it would allow operators to get a discount on their state severance taxes if they pay more in federal royalties. So a lot of the benefits that Megan just talked to you about wouldn't be in effect if this law goes forward. So it's just something to watch. Again, October 6th in Casper. The committee is very much in favor of the bill. So it's not something I think that folks should really focus on for the committee necessarily, but it's something that as we head into the legislative session, next February to pay attention to. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon. And that, I think I will try to start sharing my screen again. I just had one more slide to share.
And just a quick reminder here for folks, I put in the chat that as we get to the end of Meghan's presentation here, if you have any questions, please drop them right in the chat function, which should be on the right side of your screen. Take it away, Meghan.
All right. Thanks, Alec. Okay. So hope everyone can see my screen again. All right, the importance of public comments. I'm hoping that all of you who joined us today are interested since you joined the conservation cafeteria, and that you take a moment to add your voice in support of the fluid mineral leases and leasing process rule by September 22nd. And again, reasons to do so are because this rule modernizes oil and gas leasing program with timely and important improvements. It better incorporates conservation and recreation into the decision-making process. It would improve landscape health with timely cleanup and offer a better return for taxpayers. And again, there's plenty of opposition from industry and politicians. So we really want to provide a counterbalance and tell the BLM what provisions we like. And we can also tell the BLM where they have opportunities to go further. I, for instance, love the leasing preference criteria, but am hoping that they will make them a little bit stronger. Right now, there's a lot of discretion at the field office level with individual authorizing officers, and I would like to see the BLM take that further. So also, the BLM at one of their informational meetings specifically said, we need you to participate and make the rule as robust as possible. So I hope I can count on all of you to do that. And you can either go online to submit comments at the Federal Register at this address, or you can always submit a comment through the mail, snail mail. And we'll be sharing all of this information out as an action alert to our walk membership. And hopefully all of you are signed up to get alerts from us. And again, the deadline is September 22nd. So we've got about 3 more weeks. And I hope that everyone takes advantage of that opportunity. And then I am actually going to stop sharing the screen, and I think we'll open it up for questions, but I'm going to go run and get my cord because my computer needs a little more juice. So I'll be back in a minute.
Thanks, Meghan. So while we wait for Meghan to plug her computer in, yeah, I just wanted to remind folks that we have the chat function over here on the right-hand side of your screens for questions. Shannon, I see you dropped in the link to the bill or the interim committee workings there that you mentioned. Shannon, I had a question just going back to bonding. I guess just for the audience here, you know, how much is orphan wells and sort of cleanup at taxpayer expense an issue in the state of Wyoming? I think west-wide, there's, I think, differences in how much that is an issue. I know that Montana has over, I think, 220 orphan oil and gas wells, but I'm just curious as to how much that's an issue here in Wyoming.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue, and partly because of the framework that we have that facilitates oil and gas development in this speculative manner that we've had. So hopefully that, you know, addressing speculation first and foremost will actually help to address orphan wells, because we're going to see companies that are more serious about drilling and drilling in the right spots with the right ability to clean up those wells. So starting from the beginning, that will be helpful. But yeah, a lot of oil and gas development is speculative in nature. When commodity prices are high, companies drill. When commodity prices go lower, companies either sell wells or they actually just walk away. So for instance, there was a company last year, it's a story I like to tell because it's kind of crazy, company called Windsor. They were actually one of the bigger operators in the state for a number of years. They had significant number of coal bed methane wells, in addition to some Beartooth front wells up in Park County that were deep type sands gas development. And the company actually just wrote a letter to regulators last summer saying, bye, we're gone, we're leaving, see you later. And that was the end of the story, literally. Like there was no consequences for that. And so that happens more often than you would think. Companies sometimes can't even afford to go through the bankruptcy process. So there have been, roughly 200 oil and gas bankruptcies since 2016. Huge amount of companies that have gone through bankruptcy, but some companies don't even go through bankruptcy. They just leave. And with that, they leave the obligations on the landscape, both on federal public land as well as split estate land, where private landowners live and have agricultural operations and other things that they need to have taken care of on their place. So yeah, it's more of a problem than you would think. Luckily, BLM, the one thing BLM does better than the state is that they do go after predecessor liability. So often, you'll hear from BLM that they don't have any orphan wells, which is partly true, and it's only true because they actually go down the lease to hold prior companies accountable for plugging and reclamation. That process can take years and often is not entirely effective. So again, a better process is to kind of require an upfront bond that will ensure reclamation happens. But BLM does have a predecessor liability that is helpful for instance, like Exxon and other companies in the Powder River Basin are being held accountable for coal bed methane wells that were drilled on their leases that they didn't even were really involved in. So it can work that way, but yeah, a better way is to require that upfront bond and provide that incentive for operators to take care of the reclamation work themselves.
Thank you, Shannon. Great explanation. We have a question from Carol in the chat here. Can we get more of an explanation on the federal royalties and what % goes to the state above what the state receives directly? And as a follow-up to that, is there an estimate of how much this would increase dividends to the state? Meghan, Shannon, when do you want to tackle that?
That is a great question, Carol. And I don't know that I've seen numbers off the top of my head. It seems like, we were walking you through before all of the different taxes that oil and gas has to pay to government. So I'm not sure. It would take some math and teasing things apart to figure out how much money we would anticipate the state of Wyoming getting based on this royalty rate increase compared to what they're getting now. But I'm sure it's in the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
So quick answer, Wyoming receives 48% of the federal mineral royalty that's collected by the government. So roughly half of all federal mineral royalties come back to the state, and that would continue for the higher royalty rate. There was a GAO report a few years ago. I'm forgetting exactly when. It might have also been 2019 or 2020, maybe a little bit before that. That the GAO auditors found that an increase in royalties would decrease production slightly, but still overall increase revenue coming in. So I think that's the general understanding, including in Wyoming. Of course, we have a very large share of the federal mineral production in the country. And so those numbers kind of reflect here as well. If you're really into it, there is a very lengthy technical financial analysis that's on the Federal Register website where BLM does a very deep dive into all of the numbers. And so there is a lot of information in there about what they estimate state shares of royalties would be under this proposed rule, but it's sort of at the aggregate level across the West. And I think they might parse it out slightly for Wyoming, but yeah, the numbers are there and BLM's looked at them. And again, I think it would be overall, it could be a slight decrease in production, but increase in revenue is what we've kind of anticipated. The largest driver of whether oil and gas gets drilled is the commodity price by far.
Thank you both. Carol, I hope that answered your question. Keith in the chat here has a great question as well, on greenhouse gas emissions. Can you opine on whether adding consideration of greenhouse gas emissions to the scope of this effort could potentially increase the likelihood that the entire rulemaking can be undermined or undone if there is a shift in presidential administration or Congress after the next election? Tough question, but Meghan or Shannon?
Yeah, well, I'll say short, that's $1 million question for sure. The short answer is this rule is already under attack. Our congressional delegation and others are working to maybe try to undo it through the appropriations bills process, although that looks like now we're just going to get an extension of the the federal funding. So hopefully things will be, hopefully it'll be a quiet September, but it's still a possibility. It is a possibility for a Congressional Review Act action going into 2025. So depending on when the rule gets final, that's a possibility, which would be particularly bad. But and I think the parts of the rule that are being proposed by the highest levels of BLM. They're with White House backing. They're, it's a strong administrative priority. I think they'll go forward. Whether the final rule includes greenhouse gases or not, I mean, groups are commenting on that. It will be part of the public comment process, and we'll see what BLM does. But I'm pretty sure that what we have now as far as a rule package will definitely be moving forward through BLM. It's just a question of, I think, the politics going forward.
Thank you, Shannon. Meghan, anything to add to that?
I don't know. I think I'll trust the lawyer here, but I guess one thing I would say is, since the greenhouse gas emission consideration was sort of nestled in around that preference criteria part of the rule, as written right now, the preference criteria, again, they aren't being enforced in a top-down way. It's sort of at the discretion of the field office level. So it has less teeth than some of the other parts of the rule. And so it seems like that would be a harder place to attack the rule if it's in one of the more wishy-washy sections. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so can't say for sure. I'm sure, like Shannon said, it's going to get attacked for many reasons, and we'll just see where the political winds blow and do our part to comment.
Thank you. A question here from Sadie. Was everything presented today just on the BLM's preferred alternative plan? Sadie, I don't know if you're referring to any of the recent land management planning things, or if this is in relation to the rule, but today's presentation was on the oil and gas formal rulemaking. Meghan, Shannon, do you have anything to add to that question? Sadie's question was everything presented today just on the BLM's preferred alternative plan?
Yeah, I think I would just say that the BLM has had a lot of rules and plans come out for comment recently, and it's really confusing keeping track of which is which and what's open for comments when. But this one is a rule, so there isn't a preferred alternative. The agency has just put out a draft rule, and they're saying, tell us what you think. This is what we've got. You give us your feedback, and then we'll go back to the drawing board and do some edits and present a final rule in several months. So we don't have to look at multiple alternatives like we will for the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan, which is also out now. Yeah, this one's a little bit simpler to parse for that reason.
Thanks, Meghan. There's another question here from Carol. Is there concern, given the recent Supreme Court limitation to EPA regulating CO2, that the bonding rules may not be upheld without statutory backup? Shannon?
Yeah, so I would say on this one, actually the Mineral Leasing Act, which is the statute that is being implemented on bonding, is actually very strong. It requires bonding to be set at a level that ensures reclamation. So that, to me, that's like the highest amount of statutory authority you could possibly get. So I think we're pretty safe on this one, although it is a good question, particularly given the major questions doctrine and how the Supreme Court is going forward with that these days. But yeah, I think, some of the other pieces, are grounded more in FLPMA, the Federal Lands Management Policy Act, so the lease preference criteria that Meghan mentioned. Is more about BLM's multiple use mandate and some other, requirements to prevent unnecessary and undue degradation of the lands and other pieces. So some of it is a little bit squishier, but the bonding piece is particularly firm in statutory authority.
Thanks, Shannon. A comment from Janice here, compliments to Meghan and Shannon for doing an excellent job today. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I have one more for both of you. Our organizations obviously are advocating for these changes because they seem like common sense, that they'll be a little bit more protective of sensitive habitat, that there'll be a benefit to taxpayers because of sort of wasteful, outdated policies. My question to both of you, if you want to take a crack at it, is why in a big rulemaking like this, where we have probably thousands of different entities and organizations and people around the nation commenting, why is it important for Wyomingites to speak up on this and comment to the agency about this rulemaking? I'll pick on Meghan first.
Thanks, Alec. Yeah, I'm always asking people to provide public comment, and I think this rule is no exception. I think, as we know, there are a lot of forces that are opposed to this happening, and they are, asking for extensions on the commenting period. They're going to do whatever they can to scuttle the provisions that would be more protective and add more conservation measures into this rule. And so the agency needs as much cover and support from us as we can provide to help them draft a final rule that maintains a lot of those protective measures and common sense reforms that watch out better for taxpayers and the landscape as a whole. And I think we as Wyomingites have a role to play because this state has a huge oil and gas industry. And not that the BLM is taking our comments and elevating them beyond anyone else's, but I think it matters that they're hearing from people in Wyoming where there is a lot of oil and gas development going on. And I mean, it does matter to people who live here and live around these developments.
Yeah, definitely. We're a very critical state in the overall scheme of what happens to this rule. So it's really important that people in Wyoming, public land users and wildlife enthusiasts and all of you kind of weigh in with your perspective on how important this rule is. As Meghan mentioned, this really is a once in a lifetime opportunity. These rules don't get updated very often. And so it really is your one-time chance to kind of weigh in with this administration, weigh in with the agency, and let them know that this is something you care about. So yeah, just take a few minutes. It doesn't take long to use the regulations.gov process and submit a comment. It's pretty easy to do on the website. So yeah, just encourage you all to do that.
And Carol had asked if we will have access to the slides here, and Carol, we'd be happy to share those with you. And a recording of this presentation too will be posted somewhere, but we'll be sending that out to all participants. So I want to thank everyone for joining today as we kind of approach the end of the hour here, and put in one last plug here that we really depend on engaged citizens to help us further our mission and advocate for some of these changes that Meghan and Shannon talked about today. And so I want to thank everybody and say just getting involved with your local organizations are really important. I'm just dropping in the chat here both links to Powder River Basin Resource Council, which Shannon works for, and of course Wyoming Outdoor Council that Meghan and I work for, and both great organizations. So we hope that you'll get more involved. Thanks to everyone for joining today, and we will be ending the recording and the call. Thanks a bunch.